you haven't figured it out already, we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 25, actually chapters 25 through 27 tonight. We're getting to the section in the Old Testament where we're covering a pretty good section at a time, so obviously we're not going to be able to read all these verses within the chapter. And so I'd encourage you guys, if you would, make your best effort to try to read over these before Wednesday nights. I know everybody's busy and there's limited time in the days in the week. But if you can do that, that would sure help our discussion go a lot faster. And so we don't have to fill in all the blanks along the way. Next week, I think we got 4 chapters we've got to cover, so 28 through 31, if you want to put that in your memory bank for next week. So we're going to read about some of the, we talked about last week about the covenant, God confirming the covenant with Israel. And really what we're looking at is, in part, the instructions that God gave Moses when he was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. And of course, part of that involved, those of you who've studied the Old Testament before, and particularly the book of Exodus, if you recalled as we went through it, part of that entails the instructions for building the tabernacle. And so that's basically what we're reading about here. Next week, we're going to talk about the priesthood and some of the clothing surrounding it. But we're going to focus tonight on some of the articles and on the tabernacle itself. Of course, these instructions that God gave to Moses to build while he was up on Mount Sinai. So question number 1, when you think about the construction of the tabernacle, obviously, you know, it wasn't a one-man job. It wasn't something that one individual went out here and did all by himself. There were a lot of different people who were involved. A lot of different skilled workers who invested their time and their energy and their talents into making things for the tabernacle itself. And so it took the collective group of the children of Israel working together in order to accomplish that. And one of the key lessons that we often emphasize from the construction of the tabernacle is how everybody worked together and how it went like it was supposed to go, and how it turned out like God wanted it to be. And so we kind of apply that lesson generally to the church, which is a good lesson. But question number 1 deals with that idea. And the question is, how do people benefit when they work well together, or they work together as a team? What are some benefits of people working together, working well together?
You get more done.
Okay, that's really the first thing that comes to mind, isn't it? We, you know, as an individual, there's only certain things that you can do. There's only a certain amount of work you can do, but it also, sometimes there's only, you know, if you only have 2 hands, you're limited in some things that you can do. It might take 2 people in order to accomplish a task. And so obviously one of the benefits that's going to come from people working together is you're going to get more work done because you have more than 2 hands involved. What else would you think? Okay, and why would that be the case? Do we have anybody in here that likes to work alone? Maybe? Well, it may not be for everybody then.
Depends on who else is on the team.
Okay, yeah, it really does, doesn't it? So if you have the wrong person, you know, involved in something, it can be a pretty tedious job, can't it? But if everybody's who's involved, you know, is on board, and they're all vested, and they're all trying to accomplish the same thing, and they're not too overbearing or anything like that, then it makes working a lot more enjoyable. You know, sometimes you have to do some jobs that aren't too enjoyable in and of themselves, but if you have somebody standing along your side helping you or doing it with you, you know, it kind of makes it a little more bearable or enjoyable work. Anything else you can think of? Okay, certainly, because you're involving more skill, right? You're involving more talent. You're not just limited to what one person can think and one person can do. And so, yeah, generally speaking, there's a better product that's going to be produced. So there's a lot of benefits that come when people work together as a team. So question number 2 is, what are some difficulties that can be encountered when people work together?
Too many chiefs.
Okay, everybody wants to be in charge, right? you have to have somebody in charge, don't you, when you're talking about a group of people, and you have to have somebody overseeing that work, but you also have to have people who are willing to submit to leadership. And if you don't have that, that's, of course, not going to work. What else do you think of?
Personality clashes.
Yeah, personalities, different personalities, and like we said before, sometimes some people are easier to get along with than other people, and so you get the wrong type of personalities involved, and rather than getting more accomplished, you can actually hurt the work in and of itself. So there's conflicts that are involved. I thought morale is probably one of those things that depending on who you're working with, or if you're working by yourself or with somebody else, that can help one way or the other. So all those things were factors. When you think about the children of Israel, why did everything work like it was supposed to work? Well, it took everybody doing their part. It took everybody cooperating. It took very skilled people doing their part. It took people, some people were just contributing to the work itself. But what would that have been without them? I mean, you wouldn't have had anything to build. So they were providing materials. So you have all these people working together, and that made the construction of the tabernacle a success. Okay, so let's go to Exodus chapter 25, and I'll just start in here and kind of, I guess I'll give out scriptures as we have time, and if we start running out of time, we'll probably just have to speed it up and summarize some of these things. But if I can, somebody read for us Exodus 25, 1 through 7.
Spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they may bring me an offering of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart. Ye shall take my offering. And this is the offering which they shall take thereof: gold and silver and brass and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen and goat's hair and ram skin dyed red and badger skin, shittim wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil, and sweet incense, onyx stones and stones to be set in the ephod and in the breastplate.
Okay, so question number 3 on your handout. Who was it that came up with these plans for the tabernacle? Yeah, God was the architect, wasn't he? And when you think about the importance of an architect, how important is an architect when it comes to building something? I mean, that's where it all starts, isn't it? If you don't have the right ratios, if you don't have the right sizes, if it's not planned out and blueprinted in such a way that it's going to work, then it doesn't matter what anybody else does. It's all going to be for nothing. You think about God. God is the one who designs and comes up with the furniture for the tabernacle, the dimensions for the tabernacle itself. And why do you think that's the case? Obviously, there's, we're reading, as you go through this, there were a lot of skilled men here within Israel. And so why didn't God just choose one of them and say, hey, why don't you design the tabernacle for us?
There have been too many different ideas of what it should look like, and they couldn't have agreed on it, but they had God to give them the directions that they needed to follow, and they knew they had to follow them exactly.
Okay. And why do you think God was so meticulous? In other words, when he gave these designs, why didn't he say, well, if you guys want to, change a little bit over here, do something a little bit different, or if you come up with a better idea, why don't you just let me know and we'll look into that.
Obedience.
Okay? Obedience is certainly one of the things, a test. Why else? Can you think of anything else?
Well, he wanted them to be real particular about how to worship him and follow him at the set time.
Yeah, and that's really the way that God's always been, isn't it? It's not that when it comes to worshiping God, God has just kind of given man this free reign, if you will, and say, well, you just decide whatever you want to do, and how much you want to give, and how you want things to go, and that's going to be okay with me. But there's a really important point, I think, sometimes too, that we miss in pointing out. God took all this time to design and plan, and when he gave these things to man, he says, make sure you do it exactly like I told you to do. And that principle is found over in the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5, it's talking about the tabernacle and the priesthood and the instruments that were involved there. But it says, who served the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown unto you on the mountain. So the Hebrew writer is emphasizing how, all these things that were involved in the tabernacle, the construction, the instruments, the people and the priesthood, everything that was involved was a copy of what? Yeah, it was a copy, it was a shadow of heavenly things, spiritual things. And so God designed the tabernacle in such a way as to where people could look at it and they could have this shadowy glimpse, of things that God was preparing for the future that would come in the future. And so when you think about God designing it and saying, now make sure you do everything right down to the T, that's why God was so meticulous, in these things. Because if men started changing these things and, or adding things or taking things away from it, then it's going to ruin this shadow, this figure, this copy that God has made to try to at least provide a glimpse and maybe teach men along the way as they're worshiping through these physical objects about things that are going to come. And so part of the purpose of the tabernacle was to foreshadow heavenly things. Why else did Israel need a tabernacle?
Because it could be moved. It could be moved from place to place. He told them where to put it, when to put it.
Okay, yeah, it certainly needed to be movable, didn't it? Because for the next 40 years, and really I think, what was it, about, if memory serves me right, about 500 years, I think, before the temple would actually be built, that the tabernacle and the setup would be carried on. And so obviously for the purpose of movability, it wasn't a permanent structure. God didn't want it to be. What did men do in the tabernacle? What was the purpose of it? Sacrifice? Okay, somebody else?
Worship.
Yeah, worship. And so you have this idea, does man need to worship God? Yeah, I mean, worship isn't for God's benefit, right? God's going to be God no matter if man chooses to worship him or not. He doesn't need to be adored and lauded by men in order to be who he is. It's not something that he needs, but it's something that we as human beings need to do. And so God builds this place of worship. Obviously, they've just come up out of Egypt. They don't even have a homeland yet. And so what do they need? Well, they need a place where they can come together and worship God. And the tabernacle is going to provide that for them. All right, so question number 4, where does Moses get all the materials to construct the tabernacle? You read about all these precious metals. We have gold and silver and bronze. We have, these precious jewels, the finest of fabrics that are involved. Where does Moses get all these things to build that tabernacle?
Well, actually got it from the Egyptians, probably.
Yeah.
You gotta start with it.
Yeah, if you want to go way back, right? It really goes back to the idea that when Israel came up out of Egypt, the Bible says they didn't leave empty-handed, right? The Egyptians were glad to give them things, get rid of, get out of here. We'll give you this, we'll give you that, But when they came out with a lot of wealth. And you have to think in your mind, well, why did God do that? They could have very well came out with nothing. God could have taken care of them and provided for them, right? But part of it involved in the mind of God the construction of this tabernacle. How you go build this thing if you don't have access to gold and silver and bronze and all these precious jewels and all these precious materials. And so God prepared his people for that. Ultimately, it came from Egypt. The Israelites took it from the Egyptians, but then Moses asked them, God asked them to give freely, to contribute to the construction of this tabernacle. And so you have the principle, did God tell each person what they were supposed to give? No. Did he tell them how much? No, he didn't tell them what they had to give, didn't tell them how much they had to give, but how did he want them to give? Yeah, willingly and freely and generously, right? And so you have this principle. I know there are some times in the Bible when we read about God says, we'll give X amount, or do this, or give me this. But what does God really want?
Our hearts.
Yeah, he wants us to be free and generous givers, doesn't he? He doesn't want to have to say, give this amount to me or give this to me. He wants us to be the type of people, who are very generous and willing to give. And that's what you see, that's what it took for this tabernacle to be built.
To their credit, if my memory's right, didn't they have to turn them away? He said, because they kept coming with stuff, and he said, we've got enough.
Yeah, so that's again, it's just a testimony, I think, to the type of heart that they had at the time, their willingness, the fact that they wanted to get involved and wanted to do this, and that was freely shown, of course, in their offerings that they give. And you think about that principle in the New Testament today. How are we supposed to give to God?
Cheerfully and frequently.
Yeah, it's this principle. God loves a cheerful giver, doesn't he? And so God says, I want you to give willingly to me. I'm not going to give you X amount. I'm not going to tell you this is how much you have to give. He says, I want you to give to me out of willingness and a generous heart. And when you think about that, what does it mean when you think giving something to God? I mean, generally speaking, if God were in the flesh here today and you were going to give him something, what kind of stuff would you give?
Hopefully the best we have.
Yeah, when you say, well, I got a piece of lint in my pocket, here, I'll give you something, right? I know you didn't say I had to give you anything exactly, but here's something, I think we understand the concept of when you're offering to God, it involves the idea of sacrifice, doesn't it? It involves the idea of giving something to God that's worth something, and it's not necessarily, this idea that it's man's value that's placed upon it, but what does God look at whenever we give him something? How does he measure our offering?
Heart of man. The heart of man.
Okay, the heart, that's true, but what else?
Well, at some point, David said he couldn't give something that didn't cost him something, so part of it is the sacrifice.
Yeah, and that's it. What did this cost me to give God?
So that widow gave all that she had, gave more than anybody else.
Right. By human standards, it wasn't anything, wasn't it? But I guess the way to put it, and I guess the Bible kind of puts it this way in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, but in proportion to what God has given you. That's the way that we're supposed to give, as God has blessed us. So you have the widow, again, the widow's mites, not very much by human standards, but in proportion to what she had, it was everything, wasn't it? So that'd be like a millionaire, taking everything out of his bank account and every dollar out of his pocket, just handing it over to God and say, there you go, even though it was not very much in the eyes of men. But that's one of the measurements that God uses whenever we think about, the term sacrifice, or we think about offering, and free will and generously. And of course, the children of Israel, again, just a great reflection, I think, like Adam talked about, the fact that they were willing to do that. And here's another thing while we're on the subject. We're going really slow here, but while we're on the subject, how many people gave? Look at verse 2. Or how many people were supposed to give, maybe I should say. Yeah, every man, right? Well, how do you give if you don't have much? You give in proportion, whatever God has given you. So some people had more to give than others. Obviously, when you think about talents and skills and abilities, there were some people who were able to give freely in that area, where others, they might not have been woodworkers or artists or things like that. And so they couldn't do anything in that particular area. But every man, as you read there in verse 2. So that's what God wants today too, isn't it? It isn't any different. We give us whatever proportion, in proportion to how we've been blessed throughout the week. That's how we're supposed to give back to God. So question number 5 here. How was the ark of the Lord designed? What did the design of the ark entail? All right, several things that are mentioned here. Particular type of wood. What type of wood?
Shredded.
Do what?
Shine wood?
Yeah, Shittim wood. New King James Version says acacia. You know, we don't know exactly what kind of wood that is, but it's probably wood that lasted a long time. I'd say it didn't rot very fast. And so it was to be made out of a particular type of wood. Did it have dimensions to it? Yeah, exact. Right down to the well, I guess we could say cubit. I was going to say inch, but it's a cubit that he talks about, the measurement that's supposed to be there. And then it was made out of wood, but what was it overlaid with?
Pure gold.
Yeah, pure gold. It had molding. You know, it had a molding that was supposed to go around it. And what was in the four corners of it? Yeah, the four golden rings. And what were those for? And poles were supposed to be made. They were supposed to be overlaid in gold. The poles were supposed to be put through the rings. And then what was supposed to never happen to the poles? They were never supposed to be moved. And why is that? Yeah, you weren't supposed to touch the holy things, right? And so it was the way that God authorized the ark to be moved without any physical harm coming to anybody. Question number 6, what was supposed to go inside the ark? Yeah, over the course of history, there were some things that were added to the ark. But initially, what was the only thing that was put in it?
Testimony.
Yeah, the testimony of God. You look in verse 22. What does that mean? What's the testimony? Somebody have a different version that says something differently?
Well, it would have been like the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, it would have been the 10 Commandments. And, you know, when you look at the law, obviously Moses is up there 40 days and 40 nights. There were more than 10 Commandments, right, that God gave to Israel. But what could you say about the 10 Commandments and their relationship to the law?
They're the core foundation.
Yeah, they represented the whole law, didn't they? You know, we've talked about it before, how you have your section, you know, things that you did for your love for God, things that you did for love for your fellow man. And so they embodied the entire law in and of itself. They were representative of the greater picture of the law itself. Those things were put inside the Ark of the Covenant. Why do you think that was the case? Did people look in the Ark a lot? No. You looked in the Ark, you died, didn't you? So why would you put them somewhere and then cover them up?
I guess the same reason you put money in the bank. You don't see it every day, but you know that it's there to give you comfort. And so therefore, God's commands being in that particular place and nobody being able to have access to it will give you comfort that it was supposed to be.
Yeah, it represented, again, you know, the idea of what was this relationship between God and man based upon. It was based upon this covenant, wasn't it? It was based upon the keeping of the law. What do you think would have happened, and this is just speculation, but what do you think would have happened if God allowed Israel free access to the 10 Commandments? In other words, they could do anything that they wanted with it.
They lost them. They probably would have lost them.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah, eventually, right? Maybe not immediately, but
You might do a little add-on, except.
okay. I mean, you kind of open the door for all kinds of stuff, don't you? And you know, there are times when you read about Israel when they take, you know, these physical relics and they make them into this object of worship, don't they? You know, so I think there's probably a lot of reasons why God did what He did, but it's representative of the covenant. And so you have, we're not going to get anywhere, but you have the mercy seat over the top. And what do you think that represents? Why would you have a mercy seat on the covenant? Remember, there are the two cherubims with their wings stretched out.
Well, if you're approaching God for mercy, that's where you'd be, and then get right over, basically over the commandments.
Yeah, and when you think about God or man's relationship with God, if you base that relationship upon law alone, what's our relationship with God going to be like?
We don't have one.
You ain't gonna have one, all right? It takes the mercy of God, doesn't it? And it takes us obeying the law. Are we gonna mess up sometimes? Yeah. But it takes God being merciful to us to maintain that relationship and that covenant with Him. So I think there's a lot of significance in all those things that we read about in the ark. So we read about the table of showbread here. You're just gonna have to read about it at home if you've never done it before. But question 7 is, how is that construction of that table described? Was it smaller or bigger than the ark?
Was that a game?
I don't know. What were the dimensions? Look at it. I think 23 and 24, somewhere in here. Yeah, it's a little bit smaller, isn't it? A little bit smaller, if I did my math right. Sometimes I don't do math very well, but I think I did. But it's a little bit smaller than the Ark of the Covenant. You know, it had plates that went along with it. It had dishes, it had pitchers, it had bowls, and it had kind of a lip around the outside of it where it held the bread in. Table of showbread. And what was the purpose of the table of showbread? Right? What happened on it?
It's to remind them, wasn't it?
Okay, I think it was certainly a reminder of sorts, but what was actually on it?
Priest had continually, is that where they put the bread, right?
Yeah, you had 12 different loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and they were always showing. They were always in the open. That's why they called it the table of showbread, because the bread was always showing. It was always before the face of God. And what do you think that would represent? Remember, the things we're reading about are shadowy things. It's kind of a hard question because there's a lot of different ideas concerning it. I don't think there's anywhere in the Bible where it just comes out and says, well, this is the representation of it. Some people think it's the idea of, God providing for Israel all the time, every day. We have to rely upon God to provide for us if we're going to be pleasing in His sight. That was a lesson that Israel had a hard time learning. But maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just the case that, again, these represented the 12 tribes of Israel. God was always watching over them, right? And they were supposed to always be associated with God. And so maybe the fact that they were always there on that showbread or table of showbread in the temple represented that. I just don't know for sure what that is.
Was there any order to the display for the showbread?
The bread?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think there were there 3 rows of 4? Is that right? Or 4 rows of 3?
I think so.
I don't remember which one it was. Yeah, there was a little bit of order to it in its design.
There was an order to the 12 tribes, too.
Yeah, and the way that they camped around the tabernacle, it was, again, it was a system that God set up. And of course, it served numerous purposes, not just a shadowy figure, but there were a lot of military advantages in the way that it was set up too. But it is interesting when you look at those things. There's a lot of symbolism that's involved in it. We probably don't even know the half of it, but things that we do need to know are there. So you read about question 8 here. You read about a lampstand at the latter part of the chapter. And what's different about the lampstand than all the other items in the temple?
It's pure gold.
Yeah, it was completely it was solid gold. And actually, you read about all these other instruments that were involved. It wasn't just the lampstand, but there were several things. I think there were some bottles that were associated with pouring the oil, and you had the things to trim the wicks, and then you had the snuffers. You had all these different things. But it took, when you read about how much it took 75 pounds of pure gold just to build that. I mean, you think about a lampstand, I think, well, this little thing, you know, just carry around, do whatever with it. But to build it and all the instruments that were involved in it, it took 75 pounds talent of gold to construct that. And why do you think, what do you think the lampstand represents?
Was this the lampstand that they never let go out?
Yeah.
God is a light.
Yeah, what we talked about how the tabernacle was a place where men worship God. What do you need to worship God? You need light? Yeah, I mean, we've talked about, studied about, you know, a couple weeks ago in our Sunday morning lesson, you can't just worship God, you know, without any knowledge or revelation. That's never going to work that way. You need light, don't you? Jesus brought that light to us. He showed us how to worship God, told us what to do. And so definitely need to be able to see what they were doing in worshiping God. You get into chapter 26, you read about the construction of the tabernacle itself. You read about the curtains, the frames of the tabernacle. And question 11 here asks the question, it says, how would the Israelites know how to set up the tabernacle? And look at verse 30 there in Exodus 26. It says, you shall raise up the tabernacle according to its pattern, which you were shown on the mountain. Now you think about the tabernacle, and this wasn't like, you know, this wasn't like just a pop-up tent or something. This was an elaborate system involved, all kinds of pieces that fit together in certain ways. And so, you know, you ever bought something and you open the box and you have all these different pieces laying around here? How do you know how to put it together?
That's the wife.
Yeah, if you're the husband, at first you think you can do it without reading the directions, and then your wife tells you better, and you figure out probably an hour or two later she was right. So it takes some instructions, doesn't it? And God didn't just say make all these things and then didn't tell them how to use it. But you think about it, what good would a bunch of parts with no instructions be? Wouldn't be any good. There were instructions when it came to worshiping God. And that's the way it's always been. So you read about the veil. There was a veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place. What did that represent? Why did they need a veil?
Because no one was allowed in.
Yeah, what happened when man sinned? You read about the Garden of Eden, and basically when you think about man and God's interaction with him, there weren't any barriers in the beginning, were there? But when man sinned, there were some barriers that came into existence. I think that represents the idea of the way to God. It wasn't just open for any man to just walk in if he wanted to. There was something that had to be removed. And remember when Christ died on the cross, what happened to that veil? Yeah, it was torn from the top to the bottom. And so that symbolized the opening of God up, or the way to God being opened up to man once again. It came through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So again, a lot of symbolism involved there. And then you get into chapter 27, you'll read about the lamps a little bit, and you'll read about the tabernacle courtyard itself. And of course, Aaron and his sons were responsible for keeping those lamps burning. And Lord willing, next week we'll study a little bit, talk about Aaron and his sons. So, anybody have any thoughts? I know we didn't do very good covering all that, but